Hello everyone, you're watching Physio Classroom channel, and in today's video we are going to learn how to palpate the spinous and the transverse processes in the thoracic spine using the finger rule method. Now if we closely observe the structural anatomy of the thoracic spine, we can easily make out that the spinous processes contour, shape and dimension keep on changing as we move from up to down. And the second thing that we can observe by seeing the model of the thoracic spine is that the level of the spinous process with its corresponding transverse process also keeps changing across the length of the thoracic spine. So it is must for a physiotherapist to understand how to exactly palpate and localize the spinous processes and the transverse processes of the thoracic spine. Now many a times, for quick orientation of the thoracic spinous processes, we often use the bony landmarks of the scapula to get quick access to the different levels of the spinous process. For example, the inferior angle of the scapula corresponds to T7 spinous process. The spine of the scapula corresponds to T3 spinous process, and similarly the superior angle of the scapula corresponds to T1 spinous process and the second rib. Now this way of localizing the thoracic spinous processes can often be unreliable, mainly because of the change in the shape, size and consistency of the scapular bone in different individuals. So the best way to palpate the thoracic spinous process is either from the superior, that is from the T1, or we can also palpate the thoracic spinous processes from downwards by palpating the 12th rib and then working on the 12th rib, palpating it medially and then gradually reaching up to the spinous process of the 12th thoracic vertebra. So now to palpate the thoracic spinous processes from T1 downwards, the therapist can do the side-to-side palpation instead of the posterior palpation, just because of the presence of the supraspinous ligament, which makes the posterior palpation more difficult. So once the therapist starts doing the side-to-side palpation, the idea is to find the interspinous gap. Once the interspinous gap is found, then the superior boundary or the superior margin of that interspinous gap is going to represent the spinous process of the superior vertebra. And the same thing has to be followed downwards, and again trying to find the next interspinous gap, which we can appreciate it here. So when we find this gap, then the superior margin of this gap is going to be the spinous process of the T2 vertebra. So similarly, with practice, the therapist can gradually appreciate all the spinous processes and can localize them with fair reliability. Now the next step in the thoracic spine palpation is the palpation of the transverse processes of the respective vertebrae, and for this we have a wonderful finger rule which is as follows. So the finger rule simply states that if you want to locate a transverse process of a particular thoracic vertebra, then for the T1 and T2, what we need to do is we just need to add one finger width in the superior direction. Now for example, I want to locate the transverse process of the T2 vertebra. So I will first locate the inferior margin of the T2 spinous process. From the inferior margin of the T2 spinous process, I will add one finger width of the patient, and then across this line I will try to palpate the transverse process of the T2 thoracic vertebra. Similarly, to palpate the transverse process for the T3 and T4 vertebra, we need to add +2 finger and then palpate for their respective transverse processes. Similarly, to palpate the transverse processes from T5 to T8, finger rule states that if, for example, we want to palpate the T8 transverse process, so first we need to localize the inferior margin of the T8 spinous process, and from here we need to add +3 fingers of the patient's width and then try to find and localize the transverse process along this line for the T8 vertebra. So for the first two thoracic vertebrae, we were adding one finger width. For T3 and T4 we need to add 2 finger width, and from T5 to T8 we have to add 3 finger width in the superior direction to find their respective transverse processes. Now similarly, for T9 and T10, again we need to add 2 finger width and for T11 and T12 we only need to add 1 finger width in the superior direction to find their respective transverse processes. Again, we need to confirm the location of the respective transverse processes by doing movement testing. So now we can again recheck whether this location corresponds to the T8 transverse process. So to confirm the location of the T8 transverse process, we can apply a PA glide, and then we can have fingers beside the T8 spinous process, and we need to check while applying this pressure whether the T8 spinous process responds by moving towards the same side of the transverse process, and by this way we can confirm that our localization is correct. Similarly, if we will move laterally and downwards from here, gradually we will be able to appreciate the starting of the 8th thoracic rib, and again if we apply a pressure on the 8th thoracic rib, this is also going to lead to the movement of the T8 spinous process toward the same side. So I hope you are able to appreciate the consistency of the rib. Rib is relatively springy, whereas when we were on the transverse process it was much firm in consistency. So this is how we can do the movement testing and palpation for the thoracic spinous and transverse processes using the finger rule. So this was how we can use the finger rule method to palpate the thoracic transverse processes with respect to their spinous processes with accuracy. So thank you, Aditya, for your contribution in making of this video, and I sincerely hope that the information shared by me in this video is going to be helpful for you all. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and keep sharing our videos with your contacts. Keep learning, keep sharing, and stay connected.